Imagine discovering that there was once an ancient book filled with visions of heaven, terrifying accounts of fallen angels, mysterious giants, and prophecies about the end of the world. Yet most people have never read it, not because it was lost, but because it was pushed aside, hidden from the Western biblical canon for centuries. Lenger. Now imagine that this same book quietly survived in another corner of the world, preserved faithfully within the sacred scriptures of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. A text passed on generation after generation, protected as part of their Bible, while the rest of the world largely forgot about it. Dawn. This book is known as the Book of Enoch. And if its stories are true, they reveal a hidden layer of spiritual history, one that stretches from the earliest days of humanity all the way to the final judgment at the end of time. Tonight we step into that forgotten world, because the Book of Enoch is not just a single story. It is a collection of ancient writings, visions, prophecies, cosmic revelations, each unveiling something deeper about the unseen realm. Angels moving among humans, heavenly courts deciding the fate of nations, stars guided by spiritual beings, and a mysterious figure called the Son of Man, who appears long before the New Testament ever speaks his name. Some believe the book revealed too much about the rebellion of angels, too much about humanity's corruption, too much about the coming judgment of the world, and that may be one reason why it became so controversial. But to understand why, we have to begin with the first and most dramatic part of the story. According to the ancient writings attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, there was once a group of heavenly beings known as the Watchers. These were angels sent to observe the earth and guide humanity. Their task was simple: watch, protect, and report back to heaven. But something went terribly wrong. And as they looked upon the growing human population, they became fascinated by humanity, especially the beauty of human women. What began as curiosity slowly turned into desire, and desire eventually turned into rebellion. Led by an angel named Semjaza, 200 of these watchers made a decision that would change the history of the world. And they descended from heaven. They abandoned their divine position and took human wives. What followed was something never meant to happen: the union of heaven and earth in a way God had forbidden. Planned. From these unions came children unlike anything the world had ever seen. They were called the Nephilim. Gigantic beings of immense strength and terrifying power. Ancient traditions describe them as towering giants, warriors of legend, whose presence reshaped the earth. The Bible itself briefly mentions them in Genesis, saying that when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, the Nephilim appeared, mighty men of old, men of renown. But the Book of Enoch goes much further. It claims these giants didn't simply exist. They dominated the world. They consumed enormous amounts of food until the earth could no longer sustain them. When resources ran out, violence spread everywhere. War, destruction, and bloodshed followed wherever they walked. Humanity itself began to fall deeper into corruption. Yet the giants were only part of the problem. The fallen angels brought something else with them: knowledge humanity was never meant to possess. One taught humans how to forge weapons of war. Another revealed the secrets of sorcery and enchantments. Others taught astrology, charms, and hidden arts meant to manipulate the forces of nature. To early humanity, this knowledge seemed powerful, even miraculous, but it came with a price. Because once humanity gained these forbidden skills, corruption accelerated. Weapons turned neighbors into enemies. Magic replaced trust in God. Pride grew where humility once lived. The earth, according to the ancient narrative, became filled with violence. And heaven was watching. The cries of suffering humans rose upward until they reached the throne of God. The archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, looked down upon the chaos unfolding on earth and brought the matter before the Creator. The decision that followed would shake the entire world. The rebellious watchers would not escape judgment. Heaven sent its archangels to confront them. The fallen angels were seized, bound in chains, and cast into deep darkness beneath the earth, imprisoned until the final day of judgment. Malianza. Even the New Testament hints at this mysterious punishment. Speaking of angels who sinned and were bound in chains of darkness, awaiting judgment. But the damage they had done remained. The Nephilim were still roaming the earth, and humanity was drowning in corruption. According to Enoch's vision, the world had reached a point where cleansing was the only option left. So God prepared something that would reset history itself. A flood. Not just a natural, but a divine act meant to wash away the corruption brought by the Watchers and their giant offspring. The waters would cover the earth, wiping away the violence that had consumed humanity. One man, however, would survive. A man named Noah. And while the flood story is well known in Scripture, the Book of Enoch presents it as part of a much larger cosmic conflict, one involving angels, giants, forbidden knowledge, and a spiritual rebellion that changed the course of human history. But Enoch's visions did not end there. Because after witnessing the fall of the Watchers, he was shown something even more astonishing. He was taken beyond the earth, beyond the skies, into heavenly courts, where the future of the entire world would be decided. With there, seated in unimaginable glory, was a mysterious figure Enoch called the Son of Man. Ruler, chosen before the foundation of the world. A judge who would one day return with angels, separate the righteous from the wicked, and establish a kingdom that would never end. And as Enoch watched this vision unfold, he began to realize that the story of humanity, its corruption, its suffering, and its final redemption was all moving toward a moment in history that had already been written in heaven. And what he saw next would reveal a cosmic courtroom where the destinies of both angels and humanity would finally be decided. Enoch stood in that vision as if time itself had paused around him. The earth he once knew felt very far away, and before him stretched a reality that few humans had ever witnessed. Vast halls of light opened before his eyes, filled with countless beings, angels standing in silent ranks, radiant and powerful, each waiting for the command of the one seated upon the throne. At the center of it all was a court, unlike anything on earth. Thrones were arranged in perfect order, and books were opened, records containing the deeds of every nation, every human life. Nothing was hidden here. Every action, every secret thought, every injustice was written down. And above them all sat the Ancient of Days. His presence filled the heavens with authority and purity, so overwhelming that even the angels stood in reverent silence. Fire flowed from before his throne, and the atmosphere carried a weight of perfect justice. But Enoch's attention was soon drawn to someone else. Standing beside the throne was a figure whose identity would echo through centuries of prophecy. He was called the Son of Man. Many Nooks saw him clothed in glory, surrounded by the faithful and the holy ones. Unlike the rebellious angels who had fallen, this figure carried the authority of heaven itself. The vision revealed that he was chosen long before the creation of the world, a ruler appointed to bring final judgment and restore righteousness. The wicked trembled at his presence. Kings who once ruled with arrogance, leaders who oppressed nations, and those who built their power on corruption, all stood exposed. Their wealth meant nothing here. Their armies could not protect them. Before the heavenly court, every injustice they had committed was brought to light. Enoch saw powerful rulers fall to their knees in terror as they realized their authority had been temporary all along. Meant the Son of Man would judge them all, but the vision was not only about judgment. It was also about hope. Among the crowds gathered in the heavenly court were the righteous, those who had remained faithful even when the world around them had fallen into darkness. They stood with quiet confidence, knowing that the coming judgment would not destroy them, but deliver them. For them, a new world was being prepared. Enoch watched as the vision expanded beyond the courtroom into the future of creation itself. The corrupt systems of the world would collapse, wicked rulers would lose their power, and the forces of darkness that had manipulated humanity since ancient times would finally face their end. Even the fallen angels who once walked the earth would not escape that day. They remained imprisoned in the abyss, waiting for the moment when the final judgment would be carried out against them. Their rebellion had changed history, but it had not escaped the notice of heaven. And when the Son of Man returned, their sentence would be sealed forever. The vision then shifted again, revealing something even more astonishing. Enoch was shown the hidden structure of the universe itself. He saw the sun rising through gates in the heavens, the moon moving along precise paths, and the stars following patterns established since the beginning of time. But these were not simply mechanical movements of nature. Behind each of them were angelic beings assigned to maintain the order of creation, angels guiding the stars, angels overseeing the cycles of the seasons, body angels ensuring that the rhythm of the universe remained aligned with the will of God. To Enoch, the cosmos looked less like a random system and more like a carefully governed kingdom. Every movement had purpose. Every cycle reflected divine order. The sun followed a path that measured the year with perfect precision. The moon marked times and seasons. Even the smallest star had a role within the greater design. Humanity often looked up at the sky and saw only distant lights, but Enoch saw something much deeper. The heavens themselves were declaring the glory of God, but the vision carried a warning as well. Enoch was shown that when humanity falls into deep corruption, the harmony of creation begins to tremble. Disorder on earth echoes into the heavens. Wars, injustice, and rebellion disturb the balance of the world God established. And when this disorder reaches its peak, the consequences spread far beyond human society. The earth shakes. The skies darken. Nations collapse. These were not random disasters, Enoch understood. They were signs that the world had drifted dangerously far from its divine design. But then, another vision began to unfold before him, this one stranger than anything he had seen so far. The world appeared as a vast field filled with animals. At first, the images seemed confusing, but slowly the meaning became clear. Each animal represented a nation. Sheep symbolized the people chosen by God. Predatory beasts, wolves, lions, bears, represented the powerful empires that would rise throughout history and oppress them. The vision unfolded like a living timeline, revealing the story of humanity from the first creation all the way to the final restoration of the world. Enoch watched as the sheep were scattered again and again. Empires rose like terrifying beasts. Kingdoms conquered weaker nations. Wars swept across the earth, leaving destruction behind them. Yet, despite the chaos, the vision showed that history was not random. Every rise of power, every fall of a kingdom, every moment of suffering, all of it was moving toward a final turning point. At the center of that turning point would be the arrival of a ruler, symbolized by a powerful white bull, one who would bring peace to a violent world and rescue the scattered flock. Chend, the animals that once preyed upon the sheep, would lose their power. The world would be restored, violence would end, and a kingdom of justice would take its place. Enoch saw the scattered people gathered again. He saw the broken earth renewed. Even the wild beasts, symbols of brutal empires, were transformed into peaceful creatures, living side by side with the flock. Lind, the vision was not simply about the past. It was about the future. Benzier. But before that peaceful kingdom could arrive, Enoch was shown one final reality, one that would determine the fate of every human soul. Mind, the final judgment. In the vision, the dead were raised and brought before the throne. Great and small stood together, their lives opened like pages in a book. Nothing was forgotten. Homiliist, those who had lived in righteousness, were welcomed into a new creation filled with light, peace, and joy beyond human blend. But those who had chosen wickedness faced a very different destiny. Enoch saw a terrible abyss prepared for the rebellious, both humans and fallen angels alike, a place of separation from God, where the consequences of evil could no longer spread into creation. It was a sobering vision, one that carried a message, not only for Enoch's generation, but for every generation that would follow. Because the final part of Enoch's message was not simply prophecy. It was a warning. Humanity still had a choice. A choice between righteousness and corruption, between faithfulness and rebellion, between the path that leads toward life and the one that leads toward judgment. And as Enoch delivered this message to the world, he understood something that few people in history had ever realized. The spiritual battle surrounding humanity had never truly ended. The influence of darkness still worked behind the scenes of history. The struggle between good and evil was still unfolding. And the day when the Son of Man would return to bring justice to the world was drawing closer than anyone realized. And according to the visions Enoch recorded, the signs of that approaching day would begin appearing long before the final moment arrived. The more Enoch watched the unfolding visions, the more he realized that history was not simply a chain of random events. Every rise of a nation, every collapse of a kingdom, every moment of peace, and every season of chaos were part of a much larger story being written across time. But what appeared to humans as coincidence or chance was, in reality, the slow movement of a divine plan guiding the fate of the world. And in those visions, the signs of the final era began to appear. Enoch saw generations rising and falling like waves across the ocean of time. Empires that once believed themselves eternal crumbled into dust. Great cities that dominated the world were swallowed by history. New powers emerged, bringing promises of order and prosperity, only to repeat the same cycle of corruption and pride that had destroyed the kingdoms before them. Again and again the same pattern appeared. Humanity would rise, grow powerful, forget the boundaries set by God, and fall into the same darkness that had once corrupted the world before the flood. Knowledge increased, technology expanded, and civilizations advanced, yet the human heart remained unchanged. Violence returned. Greed spread through societies. Leaders sought power not to protect their people, but to control them. And through it all, the unseen spiritual conflict continued. Yet, Enoch understood that behind many of the world's greatest movements were forces that humans could not see. Just as the fallen watchers had once descended to influence humanity directly, their corruption had left a lasting mark on the world. Their rebellion had opened doors that allowed darkness to move quietly through history. But the vision also revealed something else. God had never abandoned the earth. Blend even as corruption spread, heavenly messengers continued their work, guiding, protecting, and preserving those who remained faithful. Throughout the centuries, there would always be people who resisted the pull of darkness, people who held on to truth even when the world around them turned away from it. These were the righteous ones Enoch had seen standing confidently in the heavenly court. Their faith would not be forgotten. Then, the vision began to grow darker. Enoch saw a time when the struggles of the world would intensify. Conflicts between nations would grow more frequent and more destructive. Leaders driven by pride and ambition would rise to power, promising peace while secretly preparing for domination. Entire populations would be deceived. Truth would become harder to recognize as lies were repeated, so often that many would begin to accept them as reality. People would chase knowledge, wealth, and influence, believing that human progress alone could solve every problem facing the world. Yet the deeper humanity advanced into this age, the more unstable the world would become. Natural disasters would increase. Earthquakes would shake cities that once seemed immovable. Storms would grow stronger. Famine would spread through regions already struggling to survive. Many would look at these events and believe they were simply natural cycles. But Enoch's vision suggested something deeper was happening. Creation itself was responding to the spiritual condition of the world. Just as the rebellion of the Watchers had once disrupted the balance between heaven and earth, the growing corruption of humanity would begin to disturb the harmony of creation once again. The signs would appear not only in human societies, but in the very fabric of the natural world. As these disturbances increased, fear would begin to spread. People would search desperately for answers. Some would look to political leaders for solutions. Others would turn to new philosophies or technologies, hoping human ingenuity could restore stability. But according to Enoch's vision, the true turning point would come from somewhere no human authority could control. A ruler, unlike any before, would appear. This figure would rise during a time of global uncertainty, when nations were desperate for order and stability. He would speak with confidence and promise unity in a fractured world. Many would welcome him as a savior of civilization, believing he held the answers to humanity's problems. Yet, Enoch sensed that something about this ruler was deeply deceptive. Behind the appearance of peace would be a system built on control. Those who questioned it would be silenced. Those who refused to follow it would be marginalized. Slowly, power would concentrate into the hands of a small group determined to reshape the world according to their own vision. For a time, it would seem as if darkness had finally gained the upper hand. The righteous would face increasing pressure to compromise their beliefs. Faith would be mocked, truth would be distorted, and many would abandon the principles that had guided humanity for centuries. Yet even during this dark period, the vision did not end in defeat. Because just when the world appeared closest to total collapse, the heavens themselves would begin to move. Enoch saw the sky open, angelic armies, countless and radiant, descending from the heights of heaven. The forces that had once been hidden from human sight would reveal themselves openly. The same archangels who had bound the rebellious Watchers long ago would return once more. But the visions also showed that darkness never moved alone. For every hidden influence working to corrupt the world, there were also unseen guardians working to preserve it. Angels still watched over the unfolding story of humanity, just as they had in the beginning. They moved quietly, often unnoticed, guiding events in subtle ways to prevent the world from collapsing completely into chaos. This balance between corruption and protection had defined human history. And yet, according to Enoch's vision, that balance would not last forever. A moment would come when the hidden conflict would no longer remain hidden. The spiritual war that had shaped centuries would begin to break through into the open. Signs would appear that even the most skeptical minds would struggle to explain. Some would appear in the heavens. Plainest, Enoch remembered being shown the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, how they followed precise laws established by God from the beginning. The heavenly bodies were not random objects drifting through space. They were markers, signals woven into the structure of creation itself. And when the final era approached, those signals would begin to change. Strange celestial events would capture the attention of the world. The skies would display patterns and disturbances that scholars and scientists would debate endlessly. Some would insist these were merely natural phenomena, predictable events within the universe. Others would begin to wonder whether the heavens were announcing something far greater. Enoch had seen that the heavens were capable of speaking without words. Just as ancient prophets had once looked to the skies for signs, future generations would also find themselves watching the stars with growing unease, not because the heavens were threatening humanity, but because they were reminding humanity that history was moving toward a predetermined conclusion. At the same time, the earth itself would begin to respond. Enoch saw oceans shifting, climates changing, and lands that once seemed stable becoming unpredictable. Entire regions would struggle with disasters that seemed to arrive one after another. These events would force people to confront the fragility of the world they had built. And many would try to explain these disruptions purely through science and human activity. But Enoch understood that creation and morality were deeply connected. When humanity moved further from the principles that sustained life, creation itself reflected that imbalance. The earth had been designed to exist in harmony with human stewardship, not human exploitation. When that harmony broke, the consequences appeared everywhere. Still, even during these troubling times, hope would remain. Enoch's visions repeatedly returned to the same central promise. The faithful would not be forgotten. Those who held on to truth, even when surrounded by confusion and deception, would play an important role in the final chapter of history. Their faith would act like small lights scattered across a dark landscape. And just as darkness cannot extinguish a single flame without first reaching it, the forces of corruption would never be able to eliminate every voice of righteousness. There would always be individuals who refused to surrender their conscience to the pressures of the world. These were the people Enoch had seen standing before the throne. They were not kings or conquerors. They were ordinary individuals whose loyalty to truth placed them among the righteous. Their reward would not be measured by wealth or status, but by their faithfulness during times when faith itself became difficult. But Enoch also knew that many would ignore the warnings. Throughout history, people had often dismissed prophetic messages because the world around them seemed stable. Nations felt permanent while they were powerful. Cities felt indestructible while their walls still stood. Yet history proved again and again that stability could vanish quickly. The world, before the flood, had believed its civilization would last forever, right up until the moment the waters began to rise. And so Enoch's message carried both urgency and patience. Urgency, because the choices people made in the present would shape their future. Patience, because the divine timeline did not operate according to human expectations. Generations might pass before certain visions unfolded, but that did not mean the visions were false. It only meant the story was still progressing. As Enoch prepared to pass his knowledge to those who would preserve it, he understood that many centuries would come and go before humanity fully grasped the importance of what he had seen. His writings would be debated, copied, translated, rejected, rediscovered, and argued over countless times. Some communities would treasure his words. Others would consider them too mysterious or controversial to include among their sacred texts. But regardless of how different traditions treated the Book of Enoch, its message would continue to circulate quietly through history. Scholars would examine its strange descriptions of angels and cosmic order. Believers would recognize echoes of its ideas within later biblical writings. And curious minds would continue asking the same question, generation after generation. What if these visions were never meant to disappear? What if they were preserved specifically for the time when humanity would finally be able to understand them? Because the deeper people looked into Enoch's writings, the more they noticed something remarkable. So many of the themes he described, the rebellion of spiritual beings, the corruption of humanity through forbidden knowledge, the rise and fall of nations, the final appearance of a divine ruler bringing justice, seemed to echo throughout the entire biblical narrative. It was almost as if Enoch's visions had laid the groundwork for a much larger story that would unfold across thousands of years. And if that was true, for generations, the story continued quietly, passed from scroll to scroll, whispered between scholars, preserved by communities who believed the visions of Enoch were too important to disappear. Long after the ancient world faded and new civilizations rose, people kept stumbling upon the same mysterious question: why did this ancient prophet see so much about the unseen world? Because the deeper one looked into Enoch's visions, the more it seemed that he had been allowed to witness the hidden structure of reality itself. He had seen the fall of the Watchers. He had seen the rise of the Nephilim. He had seen the corruption of humanity spread like a shadow across the earth. But he had also seen something else, something that would eventually bring that darkness to an end. The coming of the Son of Man. Enoch remembered that moment in his vision with incredible clarity. It had not looked like the rise of another earthly king or empire. There were no armies marching across continents, no political thrones or crowns forged by human hands. Instead, he saw a figure surrounded by light, seated upon a throne that existed beyond the limits of the physical world. This ruler did not conquer by force. He ruled by absolute authority. The nations gathered before him, not by invitation, but because every life that had ever existed would one day stand before that throne. Kings, warriors, merchants, farmers, prophets, every person who had lived through the long story of humanity would face the same moment. Enoch saw the books being opened. These were not ordinary books made of parchment or ink. They were records of every life ever lived. Every decision, every act of kindness, every betrayal, every moment of courage, and every moment of selfishness was written there. Nothing was forgotten, nothing was overlooked. For centuries, people had wondered whether justice truly existed in the world. They saw the wicked prosper while the righteous suffered. Empires built on cruelty often seemed to thrive for generations. Meanwhile, those who pursued truth and humility were often ignored or pushed aside. But in Enoch's vision, the final judgment revealed something extraordinary. History had never been chaotic. Reaction had always been recorded. And when the time came, the Son of Man would bring a justice so complete that no corruption could survive it. Enoch watched as the rebellious angels, the same watchers who had once descended to earth in arrogance, were brought forward to face their sentence. These were the beings who believed they could reshape humanity according to their own desires. They had introduced violence, manipulation, and forbidden knowledge into the human world. And for a time it had seemed like their influence would never end. But the vision showed otherwise. Lemdian, the Archangels who had once captured them, returned again as witnesses. Chains that had bound them since ancient times were not merely restraints. They were reminders that rebellion against divine order always carried consequences. Tumbia. When judgment came, those fallen beings were cast into the abyss they had feared for thousands of years. Leans the Nephilim, the monstrous legacy of their rebellion, had already vanished from the earth long ago. Yet the spiritual damage they caused had lingered through generations. In the final judgment, even those ancient echoes of corruption were erased. Then the vision shifted. Manda. Instead of darkness, Enoch saw light spreading across the earth. Burned the world he had known, the one filled with violence, greed, and endless conflict, began to fade. The broken systems of human power collapsed, like structures built on sand. Kingdoms that once ruled continents disappeared, as if they had never existed. In their place, something entirely new began to emerge. A renewed creation. The land itself seemed different. Rivers ran clear, forests returned, and the air felt untouched by the corruption that had once dominated the world. The earth no longer carried the scars of endless wars and exploitation, and among this restored creation walked the righteous. Downed, they were not separated by wealth, status, or nationality anymore. The divisions that had once defined human society no longer mattered. What mattered was who had remained faithful when truth was difficult to follow. Uto, Melanced. These were the ones welcomed into the new kingdom. Enoch saw joy that could not be measured by human language. It was not the temporary happiness that came from success or comfort. It was something deeper, a peace that came from knowing that injustice had finally been erased. Tears that had been shed across thousands of years were finally wiped away. Palenja, for those who had suffered while holding on to righteousness. The new world felt like the fulfillment of a promise, whispered throughout history. Lensed, but even as this incredible future unfolded before him, Enoch understood something important. Beamed. The visions were not given simply to satisfy curiosity about the future. Tengist. They were given as a warning for the present. Mondiat. Every generation that read his words would stand at the same crossroads. Humanity had always faced the path of corruption, driven by power, pride, and selfish ambition, would always appear tempting. It often seemed easier, faster, and more rewarding in the short term, yet that path always led toward destruction. Man's. The other path was quieter. It required humility, patience, and faith in something greater than human ambition. Those who chose that path might not always appear powerful in the eyes of the world. But according to Enoch's vision, they were the ones whose names would be remembered when the final judgment arrived. And this realization made Enoch's story feel strangely relevant even thousands of years later. Because when people look at the world today, many see the same patterns he once described. Nations rising and falling. Knowledge expanding faster than wisdom. Technology giving humanity powers previous generations could barely imagine. At the same time, moral confusion seems to spread just as quickly. Some wonder whether the ancient warnings about forbidden knowledge might carry deeper meaning than people once believed. Others look at global conflict, environmental instability, and growing uncertainty about the future and ask a question that echoes across centuries. Are we approaching the same turning point Enoch once saw? No one can say exactly when the final chapter of history will begin. Manda. Even Enoch was never given a specific date, banned, but the visions he recorded continue to remind readers of one powerful truth. History is moving toward a destination. The struggles between good and evil, truth and deception, faith and rebellion are not random events. They are part of a much larger story, And somewhere beyond the horizon of human history, the moment Enoch witnessed in his visions still waits. The moment when the hidden king will take his throne, the books will be opened, and the true story of humanity will finally be revealed. And if Enoch's visions are even partially true, then the real question is no longer whether that day will come,